Welcome to another episode of Outside the Valley, a podcast by ARC, the remote hiring platform that helps you hire remote software engineers and teams easily. Here we interview remote startup leaders, remote work advocates, and remote workers of distributed teams who thrive outside of Silicon Valley. I'm your host, Jovian Gautama. Here with us today is one of the most creative thinkers and writers I've known when it comes to remote work, management, leadership, communication, and growth. She's currently a senior analyst at The Hustle, a daily newsletter providing informative and easy to digest news on a variety of professional industries. I'm also a subscriber myself. In The Hustle, she's working on Trends, a paid newsletter and community that features deep dive industry reports with actionable insights, exclusive interviews, and case studies with analysis. And on top of that, this is a long introduction. She's also a prolific programmer and indie maker with several unique side projects such as a Nomad Hub, an exploration tool for co-working retreat, Unoia, where you can find untranslatable words of more than 70 languages, and FeMake, the home of data on female makers. Before joining The Hustle, she was also the head of publications at TopTal. Very pleased to be joined by Steph Smith. Steph, welcome to the show.
Thank you. That was such a great intro.
Yeah, it is a long one. It's also because you just do a lot of things. So I need that long intro. Cool. So Steph, I usually just start with very basic. Can you share a bit more to the listeners about who you are and your background?
Sure. I don't know how far back you want me to go, but in terms of what I'm doing these days, I guess you kind of covered it. I like doing a lot of things. So I work full-time in marketing, but I also, in addition to that, write for my personal blog, which covers topics that I care about, like remote work, learning to code, women in tech, things like that. And then I also learned to code over the last 2 years or so, and throughout that time created side projects like the ones that you mentioned. So that's what I'm doing now. In terms of further back, I did a degree in chemical engineering, and my path here was pretty scattered. But yeah, I guess key takeaways, I like doing a lot of stuff and getting involved in different areas.
Yeah. What attracted you to remote work, by the way?
Yeah. So in, 2015, I was working consulting I only did it for a year. And I knew pretty much right away that's, it's a great job for some people, but it wasn't really what I wanted to do. I was commuting 2 hours a day, living in a city that I wasn't a big fan of, etc. And even more than that, I was working 60 hours-ish a week, but also very, as you do in an office job, very strict hours. And I just didn't really have flexibility to design my life. So I decided to look for remote work almost immediately, or pretty shortly after starting the consulting role. But I also didn't want to, trade my career away just to work remotely. I didn't want to just find any job that would allow me to work remotely. So I actually spent a greater part of a year looking for different remote roles and actually engaging with many of them. I think at one point I had 4 little side gigs in addition to my consulting role to kind of just test the waters, see what types of jobs I wanted to do, but also whether it would work for me. And then eventually I kept applying to full-time jobs as well. And eventually I landed one, which was the job on the growth team at TopTal. But really what drove me to want to work remotely was to be able to basically redesign my life and be able to live where I wanted, work how I wanted, and things like that.
Yeah, I think your story is it's a good reminder of the beauty of remote work. There's no geographical barrier. Theoretically, someone living in Southeast Asia, for example, if they have enough soft skills and hard skills, they can find, high paying jobs with companies or clients from the US. And it's just more about how do you find those and then building up your skills to be hireable in a sense. So that's pretty good.
Exactly. And I would also add on to that I now have a lot of people ask how to find remote jobs because I've been doing this for a while. And a lot of them assume now that I have many more years of experience in remote work, that I did have that experience back then. And it was much easier for me to find remote roles back then because I have done this for so long, but back then I hadn't done it at all, right? I I also really didn't have very many digital skills. And so that's what I would really emphasize to people, that, it can take a lot of time. It took me around 10 months to set up the right skills, to take the initiative to learn them on my own, and also just apply honestly like crazy to find until I could find a job that fit what I was looking for. And so it's not easy, but for other people who are looking for remote work, it's okay if you don't have the skills yet. It's just important that you go and learn them.
Right. I think this is a good topic to start with. One of the things that I want to talk about, it's about the give and take approach that you wrote about. Because in my mind, like when you want to stand out in the digital world, so to speak, especially when you want to find remote gigs or remote jobs, you need to give first. In a way, that means like building something. So before we start with that, so you did write a bit about the give and take approach when it comes to hiring. Can you share a bit more about that? Like, what was that?
Sure. So for people who aren't aware, Give and Take is a book by Adam Grant. It's one of my favorite books, and it talks about there being three types of individuals, one being givers, the other being takers, and then matchers, which fit in the middle. And I guess this is a pretty surface level view of it, but basically givers see the world as not a zero-sum game. Giving to someone doesn't hinder your ability to succeed. And he actually shows in the book that when you look at many, many industries and see how people basically are successful within those industries, givers end up at the very bottom and also at the very top. And then matchers like fill the gaps in the middle. Matchers and takers, fill the gaps in the middle. And he was really intrigued to see this, like, why are people who are giving, ending up extremely successful and more successful than people who take or match. And there's many reasons for this, but it's something that really resonated for me because I personally see myself as a taker. I've really tried to, anytime I learn something, share it in a way that people can repurpose it, or create tools for people that aren't necessarily monetized, but something that, I just think is like a good thing for the world. But I think it's especially important, as you mentioned, with hiring, because the most successful teams operate when there are, a majority of takers, or at least they over-index on, and givers, because they create opportunities within the team that are mutually beneficial versus just everything being a zero-sum game in terms of like takers trying to advance themselves and not like the greater mission of the team or the company. But it's hard to actually vet for givers sometimes, because obviously in an interview process, it's like, how do you actually vet what someone's intentions are? They're going to portray their intentions pretty positively regardless. So I think what's really important in hiring processes, and something that I've learned over time, is to actually look at like, what are people doing when you're not paying attention to them? As in, like, are they creating projects just to create projects because they love doing that? Are they writing blog posts that help other people? Are they like advancing their skills, again, when no one's looking? Or are they just telling you that they do all these things in an interview process? And so I think the best way, and it's not some super straightforward process, but the best way I think to actually find givers is to see if you can pinpoint their behavior, whether it's a giver or a taker, outside of an interview process.
I really love your take on this, because so last week I was talking to Ken Wary, the VP of operations of Hotjar. So we were kind of discussing about the importance of seeing someone's past experience in creating something when you're hiring remotely, right? So I found like like hiring giver is not like an abstract thing when it comes to remote work, because it really is like, if you're hiring remotely, if you create a product, if you routinely blog, or even you host meetups, something like this is a, like you mentioned, there's a way to, this is what they do when not a lot of people are looking at it. And that's like a really strong signal that this person will be a good remote worker, so to speak.
Yeah, and also related to like remote work is especially important to find people that act in positive ways when you're not paying attention, because when you're working remotely, you don't have someone always looking over your shoulder. People do need to work really autonomously, and you want to find people that, one, are good executors when they work autonomously, but also you want to hire people that you basically trust to make good decisions, and not just good decisions for themselves, but good decisions for the team, for the company. when you're not literally looking over their shoulder, which is the reality with remote work.
Right. So in that article you write about givers and takers, there's this one interview question that one can use when they're trying to figure out if someone a giver or not, which is, can you give me the names of 4 people whose careers you have fundamentally improved? What are we trying to uncover with this question, actually?
So at least the way that Adam Grant describes it, and this is from one that he proposes, is that, and this is not obviously 100% foolproof, but in theory, when you ask this question, certain people will respond and say, respond with people who were higher up than them, of people that they helped. And basically when they answer that question, they're like, oh, there was this like CEO or my boss or whatever, and I helped them do X, Y, Z. And it's more of a signaling thing that, you know, they're trying to show that they help someone who's higher up than them and who's more impressive than them. And it also shows, like, in a working environment, those are the people that they're trying to impress. You know, the whole like kick, what is it? It's like kick down, praise up, or something like that. But when someone actually responds to it in a way where they're not just trying to like show off or signal that they're impressive or that they work with impressive people, but instead they're trying to show like people that they actually helped and the people that they focus on if they are in a specific role. So if they talk about people who are actually quote unquote like under them or who are at different level than them in the company, then that actually signals that they potentially are givers. So it's, again, not foolproof. I think this is just like one example of a question or a way to like word something to try to uncover how people think about the others around them and who they actually try to help in an organization, or basically like how they fit into that social fabric.
In terms of communication, we know that it's been almost beaten to death by saying that communication is important in remote teams and whatnot. But for you personally, how did you work on this? How did you work to be a better communicator? And what were the things you have to remind yourself in order to be a better communicator along your career, I guess? Like, how have you grown?
Yeah, I think with remote work especially, it challenged me to be a much more clear communicator. And what I mean by that is, like, when you work remotely, there's a lot of information that is not automatic. And so often can be context lost, or you just have to be much more intentional about not just how you're communicating, but like that you are communicating all of the information that someone would need to go execute a project or to go into a meeting or whatever. So one part of that is just being super clear about communication. Another part, which is more qualitative, is just when you work remotely, sometimes not just context can be lost, but like emotion or someone's actual perspective or intentions in the things that they're saying. And so I think you also have to train yourself to almost like have the benefit of the doubt, assume the best in people, and you do have to train yourself to do that, to work in a positive way with people and assume the best. And then also tied to that, when you work remotely, a lot of it is very transactional. And I think you do need to train yourself to be less transactional sometimes and be very intentional about like getting to know your team and getting to know them as people. I think if you're first starting to work remotely, you can almost like skip over that without realizing. And then you find yourself like 6 months in, and you hardly know your team past like what they actually do on a day-to-day level. And so I think being a remote communicator is about being super clear, but also kind of picking up on these subtleties. And through that, I think even though they're subtleties, like you can be a much better remote communicator. And that's really important with remote work. If not, you can very quickly find yourself siloed or just working ineffectively with your team.
Do you think this trait of picking up subtleties or things like this, more like soft skills in a way, picking up subtly, is this something that one can deliberately train, or is more like some innate personality thing? I'm just curious about what your experience on this, because in my mind, like when it comes to this, my opinion is mostly in it, like someone is good at getting subtleties or not. I wonder what your take on this.
Sure. I mean, I think certain people are better at communicating than others and better at forming relationships. But in this case, it's not so much about like picking up on like subtleties in the sense where like some people are more tuned to other people's emotions and things like that. It's more just like I think any remote worker needs to like spend the time to be intentional in terms of like getting to know others around them, and that's not something that is unique to one set of people or another. I think it's something that in fact many people who I think are typically very social get into remote environments and forget to do because it's not set up to like automatically train people to do that. And so
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's about being like introverted or extroverted or anything like that. I just think that most people or everyone should remember to be super intentional about some of those things. And I don't think it's like limited to certain people's personality types.
Right. It's tightly related to the culture of empathy in an organization, in my opinion. And I'm just curious, like, in your opinion, uh, how can you encourage empathy from the top down in an organization? So let's say, I mean, the startup founder building a distribute team, and he or she wants to have this culture of, just like you mentioned, like everyone to be more aware of their other remote team members. Is this something that can be forced? It seems like not a big word, like preach top down in organization. So let's say, do you feel like is this something that a leader can transmit to the direct reports, therefore makes this empathy culture spread into the whole organization? Or do you think it's mostly about hiring the right people from the beginning?
It's a mix of both for sure. You need to like culture is an aggregate of the people who are in the organization. So if you hire a bunch of people, a bunch of takers, for example, like back to our first discussion, and you try to tell them to be empathetic, like that culture, it will just be so strongly ingrained in the people and how
Right.
they operate. And so I think hiring is the first area that people need to pay attention to. And again, focusing outside of just how will this person execute from like a specific technical perspective and
Hmm.
how versus how will they actually add to or take away from the culture that you're trying to create. But then outside of that, what I see a lot of the time is, you know, most companies these days have some sort of culture page where they try to emulate like the type of culture
Yep.
they're trying to create, but then sometimes the actual actions within the organization don't match that. And the best way to actually past hiring, the best way to actually, you know, encourage empathy, for example, within an organization is not to put empathy on your culture page. It's to actually like as a leader, like if you're a CEO or if you're an executive of some sort, is to actually not just execute or like show empathy yourself, but is to actually like reward that. So are you rewarding people just based on their like net output, regardless of how they interact with other people or support other people, or are you rewarding people based on you know, how they support other people or how they're collectively um, executing as a team? And then also tied to that, one thing that I find even more commonly I've seen is that people, it's not just about who you reward, but also like who you choose to fire or remove from the team. And
Hmm.
so it's not just about um, again, like if there's someone who's like a great individual contributor, but is really hindering people around them or actually counter to the culture you're trying to create, you should remove that person from your organization. It's not an easy decision. But I guess my point is that whether you're trying to encourage empathy or some other part of the culture that you're trying to create, you need to actually facilitate that, not just through these like culture pages or like hypotheticals. You need to actually execute on that with your actions, and your actions are again who you reward and also who you choose to not reward or potentially even remove from your organization.
Yeah, you have to be vigilant in a sense, like, and be consistent.
Like consistency is so key there.
Yeah, and so we also covered a lot in this. I mean, in this podcast, we covered a lot about leadership because I think, in my opinion, like when it comes to remote work, okay, I mean, good leadership works both in co-located or remote teams, but I feel
Mm-hmm.
that there's a special thing in remote work because you're basically, as a remote leader, you are more constrained in a sense. So you have to find a way to go through that with consistency, like you mentioned, and just, just be very intentional of what you do. So I want to talk about leadership a little bit. So you have this amazing article about the 3 must-have aspects for quality leadership. Can you elaborate on that? What are those 3 aspects?
Sure. So yeah, the article, and thank you for reading it, is about I was a leader for around a year and a half at TopTal, and prior to that, I had many bosses, and I had this perception of what maybe a good leader was, and then I think that actually changed when I became a leader, and I realized there was all these misconceptions of leadership, and I had also because I entered a leadership role very early on in my career and at a young age, especially compared to some of the people I was leading, I had to force myself to actually figure out okay, people won't just assume that I'm a good leader. If anything, they will assume I'm a bad leader based on my age and my experience. And so I needed to really try at least to distill what actually makes a good leader. I don't care about these listicles that you see online that say you need to have strong conviction or you need to have X many years of experience. It's well, I don't have that experience. So let's figure out what are the, from first principles, what makes a good leader. And the 3 things that I came to throughout my year and a half, which I do still believe in, which are, the first one is have humility. The second one is to basically scrap any sort of agenda that you might have. And the third is to lead through influence. And I'll quickly go through what I mean by each of those. The first one, having humility, I think is really important. I think especially if you're a new leader or you're not going to be assumed to be a good leader, you can potentially kind of want to fall on this concept of proving that you know everything, or trying to show that you are a confident leader and people should trust that. But I think what actually is more important is humility is not about saying that you're bad at something. It's having an accurate point of view of your abilities. And so I think that's super important, in that you don't need to act super confident, and you don't need to act like you don't know anything. You should portray your actual level of ability. And you should be very okay with the fact that there will be gaps, and there will be gaps even if you have had decades of experience in the past. And so I think the big pitfall for many people is when they do try to fake some level of confidence, you're basically breaking some sort of trust between your team, because realistically they know, or they will find out as they work with you that whatever level of confidence that you're faking is not actually proportional to your ability. And so that's negative in that you're reducing that trust, but it's also negative for you as a leader, because if you're acting ultra confident, you're actually shielding yourself from the ability to improve yourself or to seek feedback so that you can actually become the leader that you hope to be, or to actually match that confidence with the level of ability. And so I think that's really important. And again, I think it's especially true with people who are new to leading, like myself at the time. You can almost want to exude this level of confidence, but I think it's actually really detrimental in the end. The second one is this idea of scrapping your agenda. I just think most of the time there's an arc for a lot of people who go into leadership where they used to be an individual contributor. Now they're leading other people. And when you're an individual contributor, you more so are focused on your own progression, your own career, and all these things. And then when you become a leader, you have to completely untrain yourself from that and actually prioritize your team's success and their careers and all these things. And that sounds very obvious, but it's actually I think still many people who are leaders have some sort of agenda, whether they realize it or not, where it's they want to be promoted again, or they want their team to be seen as the best in the organization and all this stuff, regardless of how it actually impacts people within their team. And so I think, again, it's about demonstrating your character in the sense that you are actually prioritizing people on your team, even in tough situations. So again, going back to what I mentioned, if there's someone on your team who in theory is a really good individual contributor that makes your team look good from a purely output standpoint, but is actually causing a lot of problems internally, some leaders will opt, because it's better for them, to actually keep that person because it makes them and their team look better. But I think if you really do scrap any sort of agenda, in that situation, you would need to remove that person from the team. And then the third one is leading through influence. So there's this concept of the difference between leading and managing. And I think one of the keys in differentiating someone who's a leader or manager is that one, you're like inspiring them through influence, but the only way I think you can inspire a team through influence is by actually also knowing what the team is doing, like actually having the skills and actually like kind of being in there with them. And so I think sometimes companies will hire people with like, again, like piles of experience. They'll bring them in, and these people basically are just like managing downwards or upwards. And I think the best leaders are people who actually, if they needed to, like if someone was on vacation or someone was sick or whatever, that leader could actually fill that role. They know enough about what's going on, and they have the skill set that they could actually replace anyone on the team if need be. And I see that's actually like surprisingly rare, but I think in order to actually, again, be a good leader, empathize with them, be really in the weeds with them when need be, it requires that you have that level of understanding. And so anyway, the key takeaway of that article is that I think there's all this leadership fluff flying around about what makes a good leader. And I think honestly, if you cover those three things, if you have humility, if you really do prioritize your team over yourself, and you actually do have the skills in order to lead with influence, you are probably the top 10% or whatever of leaders, in my opinion, even if you don't have 10 years of experience or some of the other things that you'll read online.
In that article, you have this one line that you wrote that says, you know what says I'm the boss? Literally being a boss is what you do, not what you say. So I think it's a very badass line. It is very badass. I'm going to put it on my Twitter right now. So as I was reading this and also listening to you just now, this one thing I think about humility, because I 100% agree that I think humility is super important to be a great leader or even a good leader, so to speak. But I wonder if this is something that people can train. It's similar to my previous concern about be a better communicator, or what did I say? Oh, about empathy. So I think it's one of those things that people would think either you're humble or you're not. Like I never seen people, okay, my goal in 2020 is to be more humble. But again, like we talked about here, humility is super important to be a leader. So how can leaders start working towards this intentionally? Again, okay, I want to be more humble. Well, in your opinion, what's the best way?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think there's, I guess, two parts of my answer. The first one is that I think it takes the awareness and almost like coming to terms with the fact that being imperfect or like not knowing things is okay. And actually some of the best leaders are quick to admit that they don't know everything, and that, there are these gaps in their understanding. But I think a lot of people, again, limit themselves to even get to that point because they're trying to, they want to believe that they're great, and they think that there's like being great and being wrong are mutually exclusive. You can still be very intelligent, a great leader, all these things, and be wrong sometimes. And in fact, everyone will be wrong sometimes. So I think it first comes from that, but then also putting yourself in situations where you can be wrong more often. Like the reason that I think I have developed a sense of humility is because I have learned from experience that I've been wrong a bunch of times, whether it's something small. Like I remember back when I was on the growth team at TopTal, I used to, at the beginning, think I would always know what ad copy would work the best. And I found out very quickly that like I was wrong of a lot, like more often than normal. And that's something very small, right? But putting yourself in situations where you can like learn that you are wrong a lot. And also if you just like look around you, I think you'll notice that most people don't know what they're doing. And I'm not saying that in like with judgment. I just throughout time have recognized that most people are just figuring things out. And so the more you kind of like put your eye on that, and also very clearly acknowledge like I did with those ads, or like I've done in many other situations in my life, like I was wrong. And as you do that, I think you do develop a level of humility where you're like, I'm not like maybe I do think I'm still super smart and whatever, but I'm also wrong a lot. And that humility puts you in hopefully the right space where you have a sense of when you might be wrong, or at least you know that you could be wrong in certain situations. And that's what humility is. It's just trying to get to a point where you have a more accurate sense of your actual abilities versus some diluted sense where you're always right.
Yeah, that's a fantastic insight. I also want to add a bit. So, based on my observations, like the best leaders are those who admit when they don't know something or when they're wrong about something. But you can kind of see that there's a core to the action that he or she takes. Like there's a conviction for, so it's like, okay, I'm wrong on this, like I don't know this, but I know, like in the high level thing is, this is the way that we're going to go, but we might be wrong on the tactics. Because I feel like when you don't have that kind of like core belief, team members can be like, okay, you don't know this and you don't know where you're going.
Oh,
There's a like,
I see your point. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
you know
So
what I
I
mean?
think there's a difference between, well, I think it's important to be very specific about where your confidence is, right? Not just have this like broad confidence of like, I know everything, like we are going to be successful. I think that can be inspiring at times, but I think it can actually be like really uninspiring at times because people are like, this seems super fake. And like, I don't think this person actually knows what we're doing. You can, for example, like, I think it's great to have like, as a founder, for example, to have like you said, a lot of confidence in a vision, right? Like, I think this is the future. We are creating something that's meaningful, that's going to impact people, but we're going to drop the ball a lot along the way.
Yep.
And like right now we have certainty in this area, but maybe not this area, but we're going to find out and we're going to use data and we're going to do X, Y, Z to get there. So I think you make a really good point that you need to be very specific about where your confidence lies, or where it doesn't, and not just be like hyper confident or hyper unconfident. It's more about just like, again, having like a closer sense of reality that you not just have yourself, but portray to others so that they understand where you stand and they can get behind you if you have confidence where you actually have the skills to match up that confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. Like North Star should be clear enough for the team to see, even though
Exactly.
the path isn't clear. So yeah, sort of related about leader leadership is a lot about making decisions. Just like we talked before, like what copy to write, what campaign should we run, how do you go about these product decisions, making tough calls. Basically, I'm just curious about from yourself, how do you go about making decisions? Do you have some kind of decision making framework when you're leading a team, or even in your daily life?
Yeah, I mean, there's all these decision-making frameworks out there. So I think some are good, some are not so good. I don't have one that I use religiously, but I think with anything I do, I'm a very analytical person, almost too much. I wrote a love letter to Excel that many people have made fun of me for, but I think with anything you should use data. And I use data not just in classical senses where you're like, setting up dashboards for ads, but also like when I was learning to code, I tracked every single day, like what was I learning, how much, because I think, again, even I tried to be very, accurate in my level of confidence, I'm wrong all the time. And the only way that you can really kind of come closer to a sense of reality, whether it's in your confidence or whether it's in your progress on a project, is having some sort of data. Like, data doesn't lie. We lie to ourselves with stories.
Yeah.
And so the best way that, whether it's like when you're creating your own decision-making framework, I think the only thing that I would say that needs to be true is there needs to be data in there of some sort to actually guide you in the right direction. Because again, we think we're very pragmatic thinkers, but often I think most people are actually not.
Yep, I agree. So in your previous job, you were in a situation where you felt like you were, air quote here, leading too much, but you realize you found your skill. It's kind of like you haven't used it for too long, and you see your skills, like your actual skills, declining. I have this hypothesis that a lot of startup founders feel like this when their team is growing, like, when they come to 10 people and they're 50 people, and they kind of miss being hands-on with the work, whether it's a product or the marketing or even sales. So I feel like it's more common thing that basically those startup founders are less happier as the team grow, because they just miss like doing the
Yeah.
quote unquote dirty work. In your opinion, do you think founders can find a balance between the two, or should they try to shift their mindset or try to focus their mindset to fully accept that their job is now to lead? A while ago, Jason Free from Basecamp, I think he's more on the latter part of it. Like, he felt like his design skill isn't as good as before, and he's okay with it. He accepted my duty is as a CEO to lead the company. I wonder if there's any middle ground between these two, in your opinion.
It's such an interesting question because I'm not sure there's a correct, like a all fits one solution to this, but I have a couple thoughts on this. So one, I think the answer may be different if you are a founder versus someone who's just like leading a team within a company that's not your own. If you're a founder, I do think there's an element of like growing up with your company, right? And you started out and things are super scrappy, but you still like love the vision of your company and you want to see that through, to whatever size it grows to. And when that happens, inevitably your role will change very significantly. But I do think there's an element where that's like kind of interesting because you are growing up with your company. And whether like with Jason, like he used to design and now he's a CEO or a co-founder, and he's okay with that. However, there are cases where you do have to just decide what you care more about. And so, for example, actually, at The Hustle, I think this is okay for me to share, but Sam, for example, Sam just loves building things. That's why he built The Hustle. He loves being scrappy. He loves like taking a project from like the stage 0 to maybe stage 5, and then someone else can take it from stage 5 to 100, right? And so he actually has given up some of his like kind of CEO type responsibilities to our president, Adam, because of that reason. He's kind of just acknowledged like, I'd rather be doing certain other things. And actually, I'm probably not even the best person to be doing some of those more administrative type responsibilities. And so he's okay with that. But I think what's important there is like you making the decision that's best for you and for the company, because I think a lot of people will make this type of decision specifically, whether they realize it or not, based on some level of pride. And I say that because even when I was in I was leading a 20-person team, and I was, getting reached out to as like being this like leader in remote work and all this stuff, and it felt really good. And I did really enjoy the role, but it came to a point where it's like, what do I prioritize, like keeping as this like leader in remote work or doing things that I actually really love? And then I realized it doesn't need to be like one or the other. Like I can still like write about remote work. I can still be involved in the community, but also just like focus on skills that I personally am more drawn to. And so it really didn't feel natural, but I really had to kind of separate myself from this like role and the title and all this stuff that made me feel good and focus on like what I actually wanted to do. So I guess the answer that I would say is I think founders can find a balance, but it depends on what they truly care about, like and how much of what they're doing currently is something that they do want to grow into or not. And if it's really something that they don't want to grow into, I would probably say that they should do something like Sam has done, where they do, like, even though it maybe feels unnatural, give up some of that responsibility to someone who maybe does it better. And I'm not speaking about Sam in this case, but someone who wants to do that particular set of responsibilities.
It also ties back to the point of humility that we discussed earlier, because you have to know what you're not good at and what doesn't energize you. And then you should be okay that people that do delegate it to other people and let them take the credit, basically.
And it ties to the thing we were talking about earlier as well, where there's that arc where people are individual contributors, and then the next natural step is manager. And people feel like in order for them to advance in their career in some way, they need to be in that management role. And it feels very unnatural. And if anything, like someone's taking a step backwards for them to go and to be in a management role and then step back to an individual contributor role. That's what I did effectively when I left TopTal and went to the hustle. And it did feel very unnatural. But I think if you're focusing less on that pride and less on this storyline of like how your career should be, you can then just design it around like what you actually want to be doing and like you said, I like the word, like what energizes you.
Yeah. I absolutely agree with what you say, especially when the story that you tell yourself, right? It doesn't have to be like that. It should be focused on what you like most. It's especially I feel like when it comes to remote work, that this kind of thinking is more how to say it? It's more common nowadays because it's more about how you can contribute instead of title of the climbing the corporate ladder. It's less about that, even though a lot of remote companies are pretty structured. By the way, I absolutely admire Sam because I feel like as a business person, he has this very authentic and take on business and life in general, if that makes sense. Like there's something with him that is so creative in a way. He built a hustle and just the whole, even through his Twitter account, it's just there's something authentic.
And I guess the personality that he shows on on Twitter and stuff is like so actually his personality in real life, which I think is sometimes not always the case. But yeah, he is like incredibly authentic. And
you see a lot of like fake thought leaders on Twitter. Sorry to say that, but yeah, Sam is very authentic. People and that's why I love the hustle. Actually, I a daily subscribe. This sounds like a hustle ad. Anyway, yeah, I'm just waiting for the podcast ad fee. Anyway, talking about authenticity, and this is something that I'm like authenticity, creativity. This is something that I'm very interested about, especially when tied back to remote work. So, starting with productivity and personal growth. So, when you start working remotely, it took you a while to adapt your habits. It took you 3 or 6 months. Can you share a bit more about the process and what are the things you remind yourself every day to get used to the flow of working remotely?
Yeah, so it did take me a while. Now I don't necessarily need to like remind myself of certain things just because I've been doing it for many years. And if anything, I think I'd have to like train myself out of working remotely if I ever chose to switch. But back then it was really interesting to switch from a very structured in-person role or non-remote role to one that was completely remote. And I switched to TopTal, which was a completely remote organization. And so they really embraced a lot of the core remote values, which is like, I don't care what hours you're working. I don't care, if you, for example, I remember my first week, I had a dentist appointment and I like warned my boss. I was like, I'm going to be out for exactly these hours. And he was just like, okay, cool. But he really didn't care. And now if, like when I lead a team, like someone would do that with me and I genuinely don't care. Not because I don't care about their life, but just like, that's fine. Like go to your dentist appointment, like, pick up your kids. Like, that's great. I don't care how your day-to-day actually looks. I just care that you're contributing, to the team and doing your work. And so that took me a really long time to digest and actually internalize. And for that reason, especially in the first while, I was still working like pretty structured hours and I didn't really understand how to optimize my time. I was still doing a lot of things just to look like I was doing things. I mean, I was productive during that time, but it was just like I wasn't really wiping the slate clean and saying, okay, ignore like how many hours you're working or when you think you should be working. How do you actually like design your schedule so you're more productive and so that you're only working on the most high impact things? And it really did take 3 to 6 months for me to kind of like rejig and really just like design my own schedule so that I could work more optimally. And so, yeah, I think it's just a thing. Especially if I only worked in an office for a year. So people who have worked in an office for a couple decades, I think it might take even longer to really get accustomed to remote work. And I think in certain cases, some people it just doesn't work for them. Like
Yeah.
their habits don't really line up to remote work, and that's completely fine. But yeah, to answer your question, it really just took time to almost like unlearn the things that I had learned in a prior role and think about things in a way that I was just designing them from the ground up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really hard to. So I've been working remotely, actually very recent, like
Hmm.
a bit more than half a year. So yeah, it does take some adjusting at the beginning, but in the end, like I feel like even right now, like nope, I cannot go back to the office anymore. So yeah, ironically I'm doing this podcast in ARC's office in Taipei, as you can see the logo
That's
behind
great.
me. Because I don't have the space to record a podcast in a quiet room. Have you ever been to Taipei?
I have. My mom is actually from Taipei.
Oh,
So
really?
yes. So I've been there maybe 3 or 4 times, but only for, a week or so each time.
Yeah, Taipei is a great place. I always say to people, Taipei is a great place to live, not necessarily a
Mhm.
great place to like short-term traveling, like a week.
Yeah,
That
I think most big cities are like that, I would say, actually. Like Toronto is where I grew up, and I would say the same thing. I'm happy that I grew up there, but whenever I hear people coming to Toronto as a tourist, I'm very surprised when they like it because I just don't know what they would do.
right. So another topic I want to touch is like still related to personal growth and remote work. Like I mentioned in the beginning, you are a very prolific writer and maker, and you wrote this amazing piece about learning to write with confidence, which it doesn't only touch about the subject of writing itself, but also the creativity part of it and the mentality of making something. I always think that one of the benefits of remote work is how it provides the headspace for one to do more creative work in general. And I'm saying this from a personal experience. Just when I started working remotely, there's I can't articulate this real well, but there's some kind of switch that basically you kind of like distance yourself from the hectic day-to-day stuff, and you can kind of see things in a different way when you're out of office, and it triggers this kind of creativity. And I feel like when because remote work becomes more common, that's why creativity will be my hypothesis that people will be more and more creative because they have the headspace and the flexibility to do what they love. And it's also related to what we talked about creating something, about giving to the world first, and how it can help when you're looking for a remote job in the future, like the proof that you have created something. Now I want to dive in a little bit into how you personally find and observe creative ideas in your mind. Do you have any particular habits or processes around that?
So I think you make a really good point of saying that remote work is really great in that it helps you facilitate a more creative outlet just because it gives you the freedom to design your life in a way that you make room for that. And so in my old job when I wasn't working remotely, my life was very like blocked in that
Mm,
if like during 9 till 7 or whatever it was, I was at the office. I was thinking about just that for that amount of time. And when you think about it, in many cases, that amount of time for me, it was like 10 hours a day, if not more. By the end of that period, you're really tired and you don't really have, some people think there's like maybe somewhere between 2 to 4 hours of really creative, thoughtful work that you can do in a day. And that's completely drained by the end.
yep.
And so I don't know if I have any particular habits to stimulate creativity other than making time for it and making sure it's not just that end of the day type thing that you're inserting because like that's the only time you have for it when you work remotely. I think it's really important to design your schedule very intentionally. It doesn't need to be like it's funny because when people hear me talk about this, they think I'm a very organized person. I'm actually extremely unorganized from a stereotypical standpoint. So it's not about, I don't schedule anything. I don't
Hmm.
put time on my calendar. I know many people do that, but I just make sure to give time to different things that I care about, and that includes my creative pursuits. And then the other thing that I think is so true and a lot of people miss is that when you start creating things, it naturally creates an environment where you become more creative and you get more ideas and you become better at the creative process. Like, a lot of people think that there's creative people or not creative people, or that like that's something that is almost like an inherent trait. Creativity is a muscle that you flex as you create things. And I saw that very strongly with most of my projects when I started learning to code and creating projects. As I created those projects, I'd come up with new ideas for new projects, and also just thought about things in a different way. And the same thing with my blog. And so I think that's really important, is that one, you just make time so that you can create stuff. And then as you create stuff, you'll be surprised that you'll become more efficient at creating things, but you also become like inherently more creative as you put time towards that.
Got it. I totally love your insight on this. So I think that's a good place to end this episode. Steph, thank you so much for your time today. I really learned a lot. How can people find you online?
Yeah, so you can find me online. My site is stephsmith.io, and my blog is blog.stephsmith.io. And then also the place where I hang out the most is probably on Twitter. So my handle is stephsmith.io. So if people want to reach out or DM me and have any questions, definitely feel free to. But yeah, thanks so much for having me on the episode. This was really fun.
Yeah. So for the listeners, you can find Steph's blog and Twitter on the show notes, along with the articles that I've mentioned here and of other Steph's side projects. Okay. Thank you, Steph.
Thank you.
And that's it for another episode of Outside the Valley, brought to you by ARC. We created this podcast with the hope that in each episode, you can learn something new from other remote startup people. So if you have any feedback or suggestions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at jovian@arc.dev. It's JOVIAN at arc.dev. Or you can find us on Twitter at arc.dev. See you next week with another episode of Outside the Valley, and ciao.